right, guys, we're going to flow back into this conversation as quickly and easily as possible. The material I had in mind for the first half of the show, I think we got through about half of that. So we're going to move a little bit away from the philosophy we were discussing, although I'll see what I can weave into the second hour from that. And I want to get into Gnosticism because I run into this all the time when I work with other content creators, other people in this community, so to speak, that whether it's from the New Age perspective or from the ideas that others have heard about Gnosticism and probably not their own reading themselves, we have the seeds of this world as a cage, this demiurge concept, an evil, malefic creator god, and they seem very hard to root out. And even when I do my best to point out the fallacies in these belief systems, wherever I see them, it still doesn't quite click for people that maybe the entirety of the mysteria is something that we need to maybe be rooting out. So I wanted to just get you to flesh out this idea of what Gnosticism is in terms of what we see it as in society, not necessarily condemning any specific Gnostic text, specifically like the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas. Incredible wisdom to be found in some of these writings, but it's more about the ideas that people have about ideas that are really hurting us right now, that individuals that are parroting and they're just interested because it's edgy and it's maybe anti-Christian, saying that the Christian Jehovah is actually the devil. And it's all supernatural. And can we get a bit of an overview of what you see as the Gnostic roots or seeds in our society today? Maybe like just a little overview of that concept.
Oh, yeah. You mentioned Stephen Holler's, the seven, was it the young thing? Yeah.
That one's Seven Sermons to the Dead.
Yeah. So that was a book that was like a Bible for me, back in 1990 when I came across it. So I studied it all the way through. So any comments that I make about Gnosticism, I actually start studying it back long before that, actually. But it really ramped up the year I got to the States. We have access to more of the books. And also there was a sort of a heyday at that point. There was just so many books had been published on the Nag Hammadi library. It was about 40 years of deception from the papacy that kept the lid on the Gnostic Gospels anyway. Right. And then just like put a huge kibosh on people writing about it. So you'd have Elaine Pagels, Gillis Crispell, we're doing a lot on Unslaved about this whole series. We've done one good podcast on it, dealing with Alvin Boyd Kuhn, one of the big critics. So I'll throw out that name right there because I'm a critic of it as well. But I understand it from the inside, right? And everybody is a Gnostic. See, anyone who, like all Christians are Gnostics, all Islamic people are Gnostics, all, Judaism is basically Gnostic, right? To all intents and purposes. If I took off if I didn't say this was St. Paul's letters or Acts of St. Paul, I took that off, or I took off, the term epistles or whatever and read it to you. If you had been if I told you study Gnosticism for 10 days, and then I'm going to read you some passages, and it was the works of St. Paul, you would say that's Gnostic. Even though Christians with a cognitive dissonance just simply refuse to believe that. So the point I'm making is that all religion is basically, if it's not 100% Gnostic, it's littered with other elements. Now, on the positive side, because you talked about not condemning, that's correct, because you can't have Gnosticism without infusion of Hermeticism. So, we're going to talk here about the right way to see these things. So, although religion is infused with Gnosticism, and there's nothing good about that, Gnosticism is infused with a lot of Hermeticism. And there's a lot of good about that, because that's what it really is all about. Right? It's body-centered, it's earth-centered, it's inclusive, it's right-brained, it's working closely with the nature's orders. So Hermeticism is based in the opposite ideas of Gnosticism, but Gnosticism being so thin in and of itself that many of its teachers find themselves sort of, pilfering, with one eye turned, but they're pocketing a lot of Hermeticism, because to beef up their Gnosticism. And then over the centuries, since the time of Alexandria, so many Hermetic elements got in that some of the great Gnostic commenters like G.R.S. Mead of the Theosophical Society and others, and even Stephen Haller, and Manly Palmer Hall, they're talking as if they're conflating the two. And, often they don't, more often than not, they're not explaining the difference because they don't know the difference anymore. So my work brings something unique, and that is that, look, there are Druidic elements, there's Arian elements, there's Hermetic elements in Gnosticism. And unfortunately, since it's all cooked together, it's not so easy to pluck out, those ingredients because the dish has already been cooked. But what you can kind of do is train yourself to notice the Hermetic elements and be aware of them. That's the study, And I met somebody, as soon as I got to America, I ran into somebody who had been studying this stuff. I didn't even realize that anybody other than myself, took an interest. So we ended up having a lot of conversations about it, and it really honed my own, because I'd been studying it, inwardly, thinking about it inside yourself, but never actually, for the first time in my life, ever getting into an open dialogue. And that was really transformative because it helped. It basically helped me at a key point, because there's elements of me that sort of leaned. I was already a part of a path, an Eastern path at that time, that was one of these paths that was very Gnostic in its essentiality. Pretty much, in one way, I would say they had no Hermetic elements. It was like, very, very, very. And I was even involved in satellite groups that were sort of the same. So in many ways, Gnosticism, I was like a devotee. I told you that Stephen Haller's book there, was like, I was eating it up. I was like, this is fantastic, And then went through other later stages where I was able to go cold turkey from that and change and see the flaws. By no means something that happened overnight, right? Because Gnosticism enters into Christianity, maybe in the form of even St. John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, right? There's lots of trends there. There's lots of study there. But then there's the study of a thing without yourself being totally involved, as you become more detached and you become a little bit more wary. And you start to discern these Hermetic elements. So Hermetic teachings were very, very big in Egypt. They're basically Hermeticists in Egypt, not Gnostics. And then by the time that Egypt had long fallen, and you get the city of Alexandria, it becomes very synthetic. And then these sort of, there's a whole bunch of elements coming together. And it's like salad, it got shook up again and again many times, until you get this kind of Gnosticism, and it's so blurred you can't even tell whether the real Gnosticism was more ancient than Christianity, or is something that weird hybrid that came after Christianity. Is it not only had Judaic elements, but as it tried to separate from Judaism around St. Paul, or you have difficulty discovering there's lots of Gnostic elements in raw Judaism, even if you don't even factor in Christianity. Judaism has a Gnostic element. Yeah, but Judaism has a lot of. Judaism is a manifold religion. The Jews can't even work out who they are. It's like there's Persian elements, there's Gnostic elements, there's Hermetic elements, there's esoteric, there's Kabbalism, which has a bloody goddess tradition secreted within it, right? And then there's Gnostic elements. So you really have to to really understand Gnosticism, you got to bracket Christianity and actually make a study of Judaism, which very few people have ever done. I've studied the actual history of Judaism. I know actual things about it. Most people don't. It's so pathetic. And there was a couple of times in Jewish history, in the long history of Judaism, there were a couple of occasions which are monumental, right? Monumentally important to know about Judaism and about our world today, how Jews are in the world today, why they change, why they do the things they do. And, and these would be things like as big as, say, in Christianity, say you picked the birth of Jesus, right? And the crucifixion. I mean, those are pretty big to a Christian, right? Or the establishment when Peter says, I have the keys, or Jesus says, I'm making you the rock upon which my church will be founded. There's equally big incidents in the life of Judaism that most people don't even know. And they're meant to be, talking to you all about Jews and everything. It's like, do you know anything? And one of the things that matters is that Judaism had an esoteric core, right? There were esoteric traditions that sneakily Jews would have to do it sort of in private because their families and their culture would just frown on this, right? And one of them was the Kabbalistic tradition at the top. The top rabbis could go to the sort of fifth level and study Kabbalah. Yeah, but that's not the only tradition. they had a Gnostic tradition. And so that would have then come into Christianity as a sort of Judaic element. And this is where you get then groups like the Essenes, right? And not just them, the Mandeans and the Ebionites, right? And the Galilean tradition, right? All of these traditions, there was many of them, right? The Therapeutai is another group, right? Some would be more Hermetic than others, and others are very, very Gnostic, right? And then just at the time that the Nag Hammadi library, these texts that were dug out of the Syrian desert or whatever, was discovered, just about the same year, or the year before, the Dead Sea Scrolls was discovered, right? So then there's like suddenly you get these texts, and they're not completely the same, right? The Essenes were not necessarily Gnostics. Some people call them proto-Gnostics. The great John Allegro thought of them as proto-Gnostics. But other people say, no, they're just Messianic Jews who lived outside Jerusalem. It's a political statement, bit of religion, the normal Judaism in there, but hardcore Judaism. Nothing Gnostic about it. It's hardcore Judaism. Fuck the Sanhedrin, fuck Jerusalem temple. We're going to live out here, butt naked and live in a little community, because we're going back to the underlying tenets of Judaism. So that's not to be mistaken as Gnosticism. But because because the Nag Hammadi library of Gnostic Gospels was discovered so close, chronologically, a lot of people mistake the two. The Nag Hammadi library, as it's called, and even that's somewhat inadequate. That's just describing the location from which most of these texts were discovered. And people said, hey, what's this thing called Gnosticism, right? And then they found that word Gnostiskos, whatever, it was Bishop Irenaeus. God knows, I don't even remember when he was from. You have to look it up, 12th century or something like that. Was the first guy to use this term and allude to Gnostics, but nobody had ever found a Gnostic. So until the Nag Hammadi library was discovered in 1940s, that was just an entry in Bishop Irenaeus's books, and he was a naysayer of the Gnostics. And people went, I wonder who they were, right? And then they thought, maybe this Cathars in France, maybe the Bogomils. Nobody could really nail it down. As a matter of fact, they still really haven't. Because as I just said, many people think that the Essenes were Gnostics, and that's completely false, right? I think the Mandeans were, so remember, the Essenes connection is important in my work because the Essenes are very akin to the Knights Templar. So you get books written about the Knights Templar being Gnostics. Because the connection to the Essenes has been made, but when you don't know that the Essenes were not particularly Gnostic, then you can easily see a later group as being Gnostic, and so now you're off on that tangent, and that's not particularly correct. No. They were members of the fourth sect, of which the Essenes were obviously a member of the Nazarene sect. It's called the Nazarenes, the fourth sect. And the Mandeans and the Essenes were part of that sect. Maybe others as the Ebionites, hardcore Jewish, into various Jewish traditions. Certainly you could say, Kabbalism is part of that tradition, but not Gnosticism. You see, so there's lots of dead ends you can get into. The Knights Templar, if you start thinking of them as Gnostic, I don't know if that really works. Just to bring that point up. But now you got neo-Gnostics, all these Gnostic societies opening up everywhere. And we've done presentations showing that even it's live and well, and that even what we would normally call the New Age movement is Gnostic. And this whole Eckhart Tolle and Oprah Winfrey number, a lot of that, why it's bent towards Eastern mysticism, don't be fooled. It's not. It looks like Eastern mysticism on the surface, but it's really a kind of a neo-Gnosticism that's extremely dangerous for our times, based in a very ancient cult. Because the thing that now needs to be mentioned is that these Gnostics didn't go away. Descendants, either ideological or biological, of the original Gnostics, and some of them have very, very dark ideas, that brings about that cyberpunk Para 1. Look at that, and I know who invented that, or at least who's infected by the ideas of that. And they're not the only ones. It's all through the media, advertising. It's a lot to do with the modern denominations of well-known religions. It's infused with all this Gnostic nonsense. The New Age movement is infused with it. A lot of the law of attraction cult, seeds of truth inside it, right? But it's been contaminated. So we've done innumerable, comments on that, and the whole podcasts on it as well. I bring that up in the Women in the Unconscious series. There's at least 5 of those programs. There's a program called, we did one called Gnosticism, a podcast. There's another one called The Law of Attraction Refuted or whatever. That's probably the best one on Gnosticism, and there's still more to come. So the Gnostics are still alive. And the trouble is that just in the same way that modern evangelist preachers or modern Mormons or modern Jehovah's Witnesses are filthy rich. We know this. The weird thing is that Gnosticism, both when it was Jewish Gnosticism and even when it was, Christian Gnosticism, which really means Alexandrian, did attract some of the wealthiest people of those communities. So now there is this weird social, and these would be rich socialists. It's not right to use the word capitalist even in those days. These are extremely wealthy concerns who became Gnostic because in having everything, maybe more than 3 garages full of stuff, real billionaires. In fact, the head of KLM, the Dutch airline, is a Gnostic. So this is just one example. Billionaires. My guess is even people like George Soros, right? And Bill Gates, if you look, they may pretend to be Buddhist on the surface. There's a lot of ways they cover, their interest in Gnosticism. So these Eckhart Tolles, they're all part of a cult. Now they refract and they make it look like they're interested in Buddhism or veganism or whatever, right? New Ageism, but actually they're Gnostics. Yeah, and this even goes for people like Anthony Robbins and lots of people you wouldn't first think of. But anyway, the billionaire level is where it gets really dirty and ugly, because Gnosticism appears on the surface to be denial of the world and denial of the body. That's categorical, right? But there's a wrinkle, there's a twist. And that's where my work comes in, to try and show you this twist that maybe somebody like an Alvin Boyd Kuhn kind of missed. He's one of the greatest geniuses, exposing the falsity. Sri Aurobindo, the Indian mystic, would have been another, and Gerald Massey, their great mentor behind them, he would have done so. But there's a few little errors that they missed. And one is this, that at some point, I don't know when, it could have been in ancient times or it could be more a modern thought, when the big Gnostics sat down, they said to themselves that, look, our mandate, our calling card, our main PR is about that the world is a cage of the soul, the body is a cage of the spirit. It has to be vacated. There's a higher light than the light, of the demiurge. All these traditional points. A new Gnostic, I really don't know where they got this, so I'm still looking into it, but, somebody with the brains came up and said, look, let's use aversion therapy. Glut yourselves with the stuff of the world, and since we believe it's corrupt, aversion theory would be like you can't quit smoking, so they have you smoke, 200 cigarettes, of a day, one after the other, and then you can't stand the smell, or eat chocolate till you're blue in the face and you never want to see another piece. Like these people who work in chocolate factories and they can't eat chocolate because they smell it all day long, or a biscuit factory, and that smell is so repulsive to them that it becomes aversive. Well, think of the earth as that biscuit factory. So they just say, keep on eating and smelling the butter and the biscuit. And, as these people who work in these factories say, I can't stand it. I never eat my own company's biscuits because I'm saturated in it, right? You know what I mean? With the chocolate that we make over there, Bourneville or Cadbury's or whatever. And this is a weird aversion therapy, right? So the Gnostics took this and said, we're not getting a lot of success in life by keep on telling people to hate the world because they're sensual. They love sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But I'll tell you what, if we saturate the world with sex, drugs, and rock and roll, let's see what happens. And through the Esalen Institute, and, it just goes on and on and on. And basically through the media. I did these debunking things on, your two on the New Age fraud. And I was hovering around this, Debbie Ford's Deepak Chopra cult. I went at that, and this was on the back of my mind. And hopefully I thought if Enslaved survives, and it has, thanks to members, I would get to then opening this up more and exploring it more. And the basic fact is, in short, the Gnostic, it's still Gnostic to say, gorge yourselves to death. Because then gorged, like Mr. Creosote in the Monty Python story, in the film Meaning of Life, you will come crawling to us, puking up your guts of all the worldly stuff and go, save me! What was that stuff about your God again? So there's a weird twist that nobody else addresses in Gnosticism. They stopped at some point. Maybe it was the decadent West. Maybe it was the decadence that they saw that they actually despise. Obviously, they are ascetics, right? There's a word. They believe in self-mortification. There's St. Simon of the Stylites. There's all sorts of Christian groups, and other groups that they've spawned. But they suddenly pulled back from this technique, just as a matter of technique, and realized it's not really working. And then the billionaire set bought into this. So the most extraordinary thing is, and I was amongst these people, so I have first-hand knowledge of them all, right? That the billionaire who becomes a Gnostic is a most extraordinary creature. They've got houses in Hawaii. They've got houses in LA. They own ranches. They own yachts, super yachts, a fleet of cars, but they're Gnostics. So I stood in their driveways and watched all this, somewhat, illiterately, soaking it up more through observation, just raw observation, just phenomenology, just using what's obviously there. And later on in my life, starting to contemplate it more and savor it more and think about it more deeply. But first, it was just like raw experience. What's all this in, mate? You're coming from the streets of Belfast or whatever, right? Like, what's all this? Billions. And then it takes time to put it all together. What, they're Gnostics? Yes, they're Gnostics. And they're the ones that are glutted with the stuff of the world. Then they send out your Anthony Robbins types, not him specifically, but that type. And the Oprah Winfrey's and Eckhart Tolle's and say, eat and be merry. Experience the world, right? To discover how fatuous and empty it is. This is a lot of currency. It has actually stabilized the New Age movement. So billionaires like people like this Oprah and others, that's exactly what they're doing in their private life. And that's what they're advocating basically to the very affluent, groups that sit there. And it's not difficult for a Russell Brand to start iterating the same thing, say, oh, that's really interesting. Or another joker, in this movement, can easily fall for it. Like you said, you're seeing it everywhere. I'm seeing it everywhere as well.
Alex Jones has Prison Planet TV, or used to. I don't follow him really, but I know that was one of his programs, Prison Planet. I mean, there's nothing more Gnostic than that title. That's correct. That's exactly correct. Of course, it has other meanings that one can identify with, but yeah, absolutely. In the total consensus, in the total view, that's a Gnostic principle, and it doesn't smell right. It would make you worry, or it makes me worry, right? And then when you see this extraordinary stuff, so this might be a twist for people listening to this who studied Gnosticism, like the person I mentioned earlier, who've been reading all the books on it. And they haven't come across this. And then your journey will be impaired. You need this extra light. You need this extra sort of switch on the light to really shine up their ideology. They have planned this out to say that there's another way to get them coming back to our supreme spirit or God or whatever, and that is to gorge on the world. Gorge on the world. And then to do that, they're billionaires, because this would be just, you can come up with any theory on the boardroom. Who's going to fund it? The billionaires that I'm talking about were able to change the media, own the magazines, own the media to saturate your ass with all of that stuff. They're the ones doing it. So it makes me believe that a very great quotient behind, a demographic behind the actual media are Gnostics, or others who've, they're lieutenants who are just doing it, making it, creating it, but they don't really know. And this goes for video games like the cyberpunk thing and many other things. And there's this off-world. It's not even just off-world, it's supernatural, which is totally a lunatic mysteria. How can anything be outside the natural world? Walter Russell would kill himself laughing at that. Nikola Tesla, any of the people who are the great brains of our world. In fact, you see, the Gnostic principles are actually quite irrational, would be even almost too soft a word. They talk about the higher light, right? I mean, their God is the supreme light, and then we're down here. But then I'd say, but we have light here. We have solar light. I can see light right now. We have all sorts of light here. Are you telling me that's evil and demonic? Well, yeah, it's of a lower fallen light created by their archon, their demiurge. But I go, how can you know that? To know that, you would have had to experience the higher light to compare the two. Have you done that? They go, no, we haven't. But we know that there's a higher light. You go, yeah, okay, so, right, something you haven't seen yourself to compare with the light we've got here makes you demonize the light you've got here? But you can't compare the one to the other. You've not done an actual experiment to tell yourself whether the truth. You just accept it on faith somewhere. The light I see right here looks pretty holy to me. The solar light, right, and the light that we know exists all around us, ambiently, and the light of the mind. And you're coming along and you're trying to tell me that there's something wrong with that light, right? That light is in some way of a lower order. I don't understand you, right? I do understand you, but it doesn't make sense to me, right? Let me jump in here, because this is where simulation theory comes in. And I think that's actually one of the crucial key factors in why there's the resurgence of Gnosticism, because first people were probably warmed up to the idea by hearing about simulation theory. So if it was even possible that you could enter into a computer simulation like the Matrix movie and have no idea you were in it, I guess in that instance, then all the light you see would be artificial or a false light, the way that they say that the light of this world is. And, maybe someone's had a transcendent, quote unquote, experience themselves, where they perhaps entered into a state of pleromic oneness, a pure white light, kind of like that Buddhist idea of the pure white light of mind. Another ideology, by the way, which is rooted in this same concept with the samsara and reality as illusion thing. And that's why it makes a good cover for some of these types that you're describing. Buddhism's a good cover for that. Even Hinduism to that degree. But with simulation theory being entered here into the narrative here, now you have a scientific materialist way to conceptualize the very same prison planet. The demiurge is, and the archons are now the computer programmers. And to get into this cyberpunk game, one of the things that is really relevant to the plot is that the player has the option to basically transfer their consciousness into cyberspace and to exist there as a potential outcome for the story. And this is the wet dream of the Elon Musks and all these weird Ray Kurzweil types that have the, I guess, plan that we're going to save ourselves from the destruction of our own ecosystem by entering into an artificial ecosystem digitally. But that is, to me, the perfect example of the Gnostic ascension. Because if you enter a simulation where you're in charge of it, how is that different conceptually than transcending to the true God, the true light above the artificial world, where you're reunited with the true creator and, I guess, become it, and then you have your own world that you can create from there, or whatever they imagine happens in this supernatural fantasy. So truly, with the things being bandied about by these transhumanists and these simulation theory proponents, we've got a very similar thing here that, it's warming people up to this idea. And I think also with the rich individuals, the billionaires, they've also got a different tactic besides just the saturation of media with the corrupt things of the world, which is to try and jailbreak the reality, to try to do something that would somehow break the system or break the rules. Maybe that's what the whole Large Hadron Collider is an attempt to do. I mean, there sure is a lot of ritual and pomp and circumstance around that, with the big Shiva statue outside of the building and the strange ceremonies that they hold sometimes with very pagan and druidic symbolism. Weird stuff. But I want to get into, to point out like a very specific point about these physicists that are trying to propose simulation theory. I snagged an article titled "Physicist Creates AI Algorithm That May Prove Reality is a Simulation." And he claims that this guy is a Princeton physicist named Han Quinn, or Qin. I'm not sure how you would pronounce that in a Chinese dialect, but he claims that his AI algorithm can predict planetary orbits. And because it can do that, that must mean it's correct about everything else it predicts. I don't know. But to quote the unusual approach taken by his work, he directly says, "Usually in physics, you make observations, create a theory based on those observations, and then use that theory to predict new observations. What I'm doing is replacing this process with a type of black box that can produce accurate predictions without using a traditional theory or law. Essentially, I bypassed all the fundamental ingredients of physics. I go directly from data to data. There is no law of physics in the middle." And there's that black box again. What do you think of this?
Yeah, that's odd. Remember this, the billionaire set that's really the powerful Gnostic cult are always looking for bat crazy idiots like him to fund. Remember I said that their ultimate Gnostic core is so bankrupt? They're finding that out now. They're finding out that the simulation that they all backed through MIT or whoever, the Ray Kurzweil types, as you say, that has backfired completely. First of all, I could have told them from the start that creating a lower order that's created by a physical man to prove a higher order doesn't work in the first place, because no matter what your simulation is, it's created by human thought. You're programming the computer. That's already a fallacy. The universe is not a computer programmed by anyone. And you can't create a lower order structure or system to prove the higher one, right? That's not the way Gnosticism works. But being desperate to try and find proofs, they've entered into the back door into science, hoping that some of the discoveries which look attractive to them will be this way. It's not going to work because, first of all, they're using a kind of science that's already bankrupt. And if you read the Ken Wilber's and you read the Arthur Koestler's, you'll know that, right? It's based on holonic, right? We still have to get there yet. So even the simulations and all the kind of in vogue science that we've got is really a very lower form of science. So the Gnostic has made a big mistake by trying to go to lower order science, like computer simulations, because people like Hubert Dreyfus and others from the Heideggerian school have absolutely confirmed that a computer will never do even the most remote things that a human brain can do. So the whole tactic. So the tactic is now PR, and the tactic is now smokescreen and just using the words like simulation. It's just down to the words. And when you're living the words like that, then you can turn, like what he's saying. It's not just living in the words about you've actually sort of gone out of dimensions altogether. You're not even really talking about the universe as the universe really is. It's mysteria. You're talking about the idea that you have, and it's a Gnostic idea. That idea doesn't have any substantiality at all. So there's a triple, like I said, a dose, the mysteria just keeps generating itself, and they can't find their way back. It's what's happened in quantum science. Quantum science originally taught them something really great, which is that there is rational limits to the universe, and that the more and more you try to observe the fundamental building blocks of a reality, the less you can see them, because there's something inbuilt into our mind's observation, right? And that's a very interesting theory and can be talked about for hours, and there's lots of interesting ramifications of that. But basically, they didn't draw from that the spiritual, or some did, but most of them did not. They were very troubled by that, because it's really different kinds of consciousness than we have. It's the right brain consciousness. Again, that's still words, still terms, but I think it works. That's the right brain reality of the creator that brought everything into being. We can't read that because we're so literally at the bottom of the ladder. But the Gnostic is pretty much the same, right? He has realized that there's because we moved on in history. Right now, they have the sophisticated tools and they have the sophisticated minds to realize that their theory is bankrupt. So I think Gnosticism has changed within itself. It's still going on. It's still being wheeled out. But it's almost like, the guy at the penthouse is dead at his desk. And there's a revolver on the table, right? But the mechanism below still, clunks away. But the brain at the top is gone. That's what I feel. And that's
the second in command tries to act like he's still getting orders from the big cheese.
That's it. That's exactly what's happening. And I've always sensed this through the 90s and into now. So my work on Gnosticism, because I got a lot of better things to do, but I continue doing that because I believe that is the case. And then Hermetic elements. So Disciples of Mysterium, the Schelling book, going back to German mysticism, in some way, driven by something I don't know, but I've produced those to try and then say, okay, let's restore. If this thing is really ready to crumble and fall, I don't think people will do well with an abyss. It'll be too much like a freezing void. So let's nourish it. Let's bring back something green. Alfred North Whitehead, Schelling. There's a lot of areas to go to bring back. So in my own humble way, we'll see what happens tomorrow with maybe more work on that subject. But in my own way, that's what's needed. And since I've studied this stuff, what's it going to be in my head or on my personal shelf? Through these platforms, we can bring a little bit out to see if it intrigues people and they can sort of wean themselves away from this Gnosticism. But when you look at Elon Musk, and I'm glad you brought him up, there's a very interesting aspect to this that might answer the whole of reason why Gnosticism even began, even back in Alexandria or wherever. And that is, if you look at these kinds of people, they're armored. Right? They have emotional plague, most of these guys. When you want to get away from your body because you don't like to be in it, you're a Gnostic. So the roots of Gnosticism are to be found in Wilhelm Reich. Right? You're not trying to get away from the planet. You're not trying to get away from reality. You're trying to get away from yourself. No, we wouldn't have known this until the 1930s, when you had Freud and the whole psychoanalysis began. So my conversations with this person in 90 helped her a lot, to sort of get stable, not fly around the room and lose herself, right? So there was this, which was a danger, because this Gnostic stuff can be very, very dangerous, actually. So the grounding of it was that to realize that it's all based in psychosoma. It's psychosomatic, right? And you couldn't know that about Gnosticism until quite late in the, in time, like the 20th century. And then even then you needed your Otto Ranks and the Wilhelm Reiches, So by 1940, and it's interesting, it's in 1940 that the Gnostic Gospels was discovered. It's just, There is another force working in life, believe you me, right, on that deeper archetypal level.
Kind of like the way that Pluto was discovered about the same time as theories of the unconscious came out, and Pluto symbolizes that. That's exactly the way I've always looked at it. And so this is then, what happened to this friend of mine, you can say is now, the whole world might be going through it. And that is that once you discover that it's all based in your own unpleasure, in the Reichian sense, that your body and your erogenous zones, your skin, everything has not been made a source of pleasure to you. Now, again, we're talking about degrees. This is not by any means a didactic statement. But in general, the Western world is armored, helped by false teaching, false parenting, religion, there's so many things, so many ways that this comes to be. We can't explore it all here. And then a lot of, let's take women, for instance, right? A lot of other satellite, illnesses and conditions like bulimia, anorexia, breakouts, even in all of us, right, comes all of these secondary manifestations of this condition, this emotional plague. But one of the conditions, just in the same way that you can have physical ailments arise from it, not to mention just general stiffness, and pain in the muscles, and every disease you can think of actually comes from this. So one has to understand that, but also, also pathology, right? Pathocratic. This creates a whole psychopathology as well, which because you mentioned earlier about the more deaths, the more suicides, right? All of that you're talking about comes back to this emotional plague. But Gnosticism is rooted in the same thing. That's what my studies have, continued to prove. I think Alvin Boyd Kuhn talks about this. He's definitely the person for that, because he definitely talks about a cult of mortification. That's his own word. It's a fascinating term, cult of mortification. And even though it's glossed over with a lot of expensive, pullovers and sets and, like I said, the millionaire set doing its thing, although all of that wealth, that California, imagery is in front of it, doesn't change this essential fact. In their thinking, in their minds, and in their psychosoma, in the Reichian way, they're armored. The Elon Musk's face, we don't want to get into the whole thing, but if you know body language and you know how to read these people, it's there, right? And so that he looks like he's in pain constantly, just existing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Reich talks very much about ocular armoring. And one of Reich's and Alexander Lowen is to look in the eyes and see the deadness. If you live in Palo Alto, you'll have a crash course on that. But the thing is that's definitely what you're dealing with, right? Is the deadness that shows in the eyes and it is also manifest in the rest of the body. Now the consequence of that is you disown your body psychically. And you get into virtual realities, you get into simulation theory, and you get into Gnosticism. You actually get into religion, but as you perfect, and if you're a higher brow, usually lowbrow people don't get into Gnosticism. They stick with evangelism, Jehovah's Witness knock on their door, like cardboard wooden people with wooden theories. But remember, there's a lot of highbrow people. You do have your Kurzweils, you do have your Elon Musk. These are the ones that really worry me. You have your, Nicholas Roerich in the past, and lots of people who get converted to Gnosticism. They're the dangerous ones because they get the money to build churches, to purvey and proselytize all of this jive, like the cyberpunk tarot, and they're heavily involved in virtual gaming and all of this kind of thing, seducing the young away from the reality that's in front of them. So it's not that there's a higher reality; there is an idea of it in their mind. That makes it Mysteria. The higher realm above the realm of the even the demiurge, right, and the archon, all of that is ideas that they have generated from their own warped mind. There's no archon, there's just your brain wanting to dissociate itself, from the body. That's the archon. So you are the archon. Now, beautifully, this has been pointed out in the highest forms of science fiction. Blake Seven, The Prisoner, right, Doctor Who, over and over again, but nobody got it.
The archons are like the archetypes that you've, shoved off to the side that are coming back to bring you to the imperial self by knocking you across the head. They're not your masters.
Oh, no. See, Gnostic elements entered into Jung. He discarded them as well. But Stefan Haller and the Gnostic movement jumped in. Remember I told you they're rich enough and powerful enough to watch and scan the world for anybody's work. And then they jump into what is basically a hermetic work, even in Jung. It was hermetic. He toyed with the thing. But they published that book. Right, the Gnostic movement tried to co-opt him, just like they've tried to co-opt Kostler or Wilbur or anybody. It doesn't really work, right? But you have to be so cautious. This is the conversations I had with this person before. It was mostly counseling, coaching, warning. right down to looking at individual lines. We spent many hours, just taking out the Gnostic Gospels and analyzing it and all of this. Because what happens is the converted person who really believes this, who thinks they're living in a cage of the world, they can still be supreme artists, supreme digital, graphic people. And I think they're top heavy. I really do. I think that's why the trend of California did turn New Age. I think it's Gnostic underpinnings. And it's worrisome. I lived there for years before I moved to Seattle, right? And it's no different in Seattle. Isn't that one of the places that the big tech came from? So then I discovered this is wall to wall. What are you going to do about it? And the champions are very, very seductive people. Like these Eckhart Tolles, they're not stupid who they pick. You're up against all of this. What a few articles from somebody like myself is going to change anything? No way, right? So, but that doesn't stop you trying.
I know people in the truth movement, so called, that will tell people that Jung is responsible for the Tavistock takeover of media and mind control manipulation. I'm like, just because someone's work was used and corrupted, and most people's idea of someone's work is based on other people's ideas of their work, not because they read it themselves, doesn't mean that individual is to blame. I want to return to selfhood as a concept, selfhood versus simulation. I want to demonstrate how simulation is collectivism, actually. This is something I'm a big fan of doing, but I like to go back to the Webster's 1828 dictionary or things around that time to see what words meant before they were perverted.
Yeah.
A good example was last week, our guest told us that the word race meant family originally before it was turned into racism, which is all being anti-racist is anti-family. And if you investigate these groups, you'll see exactly what that is. The BLMs and the Communist Manifesto that they've put out. So simulation in this older definition is the act of feigning to be that which is not, the assumption of a deceitful appearance or character. So basically a false character. Both are comprehended in the word hypocrisy. So hypocrisy, what does that mean? It means not being yourself, essentially. And why would you simulate an alternate self? It would be for the approval of the collective. It's the public persona. It's the straw man self. The hypocrisy is psychic self-murder. And I think that's why simulation theory is attractive, is because people are not realizing that it's their own sort of unconscious trying to reflect back to them in the world that simulation is what you live in. You live as a simulator. You live as hypocrisy. And therefore, simulation theory makes sense.
Yeah, and if you look up the meaning of the real word utopia, which is the thing about all these scientism, and science it means no place. So right within their own doctrine is their own it's strangely from a left-handed point of view, all you need to know is contained within. That's why in the Gnostic Gospels themselves, you can see how psychotic it is when you read them without this religious trapping. And then you realize that Judaism is born out of the same hatred of the body, and that Christianity is, right? So when these Christians get up in your face and go, we are not Gnostic, let me show you the reams of proof of this. It doesn't matter what they show you. You're already an armored person. You're already an emotional plague. So why would I want to listen to your psychotic creations? I know that you've built them up in the rubber room from the bottom to the top. Yeah, but that's while you're still in the rubber room. I don't want to read all your psychotic ramblings as you think out what we're talking about. You're not part of the debate. You're the fucking victim. You are the one who's riddled with emotional plague. But they don't see that, you see. So there's no way we're getting to this point of critical mass where the ignorance factor has moved to various other levels in which they're impervious to seeing the other side of, and that's the gradual type of education we've been having, I'm saying. But it's also exacerbated by bad parenting and just the lack of self-reflexiveness. So a hermetic person is not going to be able to even turn to their own documents with them and say, this is hermetic, this is Gnostic, this is Gnostic, this is hermetic. Do you get it? They go, no, right? They're not going to understand the definitions. So even if you did, this is brilliant what you discovered there, right? And you go into the etymology and you show them, or you bring up the argument that, look, no lower simulation created by a human mind can in any way give you real insight into something that is meant to be by definition beyond the human mind. They wouldn't get that, you see. They'll just say, no, I'm going to take this. I need proof. And we're offering this up as proof. And they're hoping that most of the world will not be as intelligent as we are to work it out and double think it. They think that everybody will just accept it. And unfortunately they do, because they own the media. You got crisis actors. Yeah, guess what? There's crisis actors on all sorts of levels. They can have people believe a thing just by repetition.
Michael, on the crisis actor thing, in one of the recent events that happened during this year's season of Sacrifice, I kid you not, I saw body bags stacked up and zoomed in on a hand reaching up from inside of one of the body bags with a lit cigarette. And you could just see the cigarette.
You gotta be kidding me.
You saw him taking a drag, but you couldn't see the face that was taking the drag. And then the hand goes back down right there in front of people's eyes on live television. And that's how far into simulation people are, that they can't even see the reality in front of them, that there's a living body in a body bag smoking a cigarette, relaxed, knowing that it won't even matter.
Yeah, like Marshall McLuhan, said, the medium becomes the message. The fact that it's on TV, and TV is a giant to you now. See, the thing in the hypnotist in the corner of the room is really of epic proportions. Because it's on TV, even though it's actually physically shrunk, all the images on it. But in your mind as a simulation, it's huge. Anything that appears on there is, an authority figure, bar none. And so a little wormy person like Eckhart Tolle or Oprah Winfrey become iconic. This is how it's done. So it's false iconography. It's false masculinity, because you're thinking it's a hero, an icon, which is a thing that the mind accepts as bigger than yourself so that you can live up to it and grow into it. The media has furnished us with these Gnostic versions. Gnosticism with a lot of different things that appears in many different ways you wouldn't first think of, right? And one of them is this blasting up, this inflation of these liars and cheats. And there's what message are they selling you? They've used idioms from other places, I grant you that. But what is their real message, right? And then when you go into it, and hopefully you can bring to bear, the Arthur Koestlers, the Alban Voigt-Koens, the Ken Wilbers, to have the alternative theory. See, I've learned through my years of studying this that when you want to countermand it, you have to have its diametric opposite, known. The Hubert Dreyfuses and all, because they're quite eloquent, and these are fervent people. They're just like your absolute, Bible bashing, Bible belt person. They know their stuff. So in order to counter it, you kind of have to know your stuff, and that sends you into a lot of areas you may not normally want to go, or you may not have time for it, but you have to, because otherwise they'll win the day. And I'm not a person who's willing to let that happen. You talked about the disclosure of, the underground of Irish politics. Even though I knew when to keep quiet, I wasn't going to give up, bringing that knowledge to them. Now, in a movie like Zardoz, you see, they're thrashing this all out about the difference between the Gnostic idea that the community there, the vortex, is created by. It's all simulation. Right, it's an attempt to simulate. Only this time, in that show, it was the attempt to make the human robotic. Right, not have a robot that can do, which is one of the lies that they've used all through these years, that we'll have robots and cyborgs and androids, to do the human work, this labor save, that old one, yeah, and for your own protection. No, in Zardoz, they're already taking it as a fact that the immortality that the beings in the vortex have, the humans, so to speak, is that they've become mechanistic and robotic. Because it's so mechanistic that it didn't work on some of them. Remember, they have the apathetics there. So the fallout people were, well, that's the program. They say, in the tinkering that we did to the human brain, by putting that crystal in their forehead, it didn't kind of work. And then so we have these apathetics. They're kind of eternal beings, but they're slowly corroding or dying. And they have a whole part of the village, remember, that these guys live in, right? Well, that proves us mechanistic and unnatural, because these were the fallouts from the experiment, like the rats that didn't sort of do what you wanted as you're poking them and prodding them. So it's all artificial. But then they show that in the end of the day, the beautiful statement that Berman is saying is it will corrode, right? The vortex is unsustainable. The tabernacle is unsustainable. But when you mentioned earlier that it is a collective thing, look how emphasized that is. Where even in the end, when one speaks in Zardoz, you hear the chiming in of the all. We are the tabernacle. The tabernacle is us. There is no we, right? And it's the same with this technology. It's the same with the scientism, which has now been plugged. Gnosticism and scientism have basically become one. And so it is like, we are everything. We are the all. There's nothing but us. There's no individual voice, even though there's a parody of an individual voice, but you hear it beautifully, it's echoing the whole collective. So the planet is being turned into this sort of technocracy in which everyone is sacrificing self to the tabernacle. But the beauty is, that in that film they show that it's unsustainable and it basically starts to crack at the seams and fall away, you know? And so just as in the political world, as I've maintained from the start.
Well, they also become degenerate, Michael. That's the other thing, is because they're so roboticized and everything's so sterilized that the only feeling that they can get is through sort of like witnessing degenerate behavior. And where are we at now?
Yeah. There's an orgiastic aspect to this, absolutely. There's also the last hurrah, as the only term I can think of. It's the same you're having in socialism. Everything that you've seen in 2020 is a last hurrah of socialism. It's the orgiastic acceptance, we're done. And just at the end of the party, see, at the end when you've exhausted yourself, you go out with an explosion. So as mad as things looked in 2020, read from a psychosocial point of view, it's actually a really positive thing. These guys couldn't keep in their toxic plague anymore. So bad as it was to experience it, being exorcised outside. But a person who's into holistic health goes, no, it's maybe all right. Because this explosion is sort of the last gasp of something that should have died long ago and is maintained and built up all the resentment, all the pus, and somehow it has to all come out. Damage has been done, but we can repair that. The manly way, the masculine, heroic way, say, oh, well, fucking, we'll put the statues back up, we can make them again. That's why I'm never a pessimist about what happens, even as what we've seen is so bad. But the thing is that I'm also hoping that this big, grunt or whatever is the last death spasm of socialism. Well, it's the same in Gnosticism. The same metaphor applies to Gnosticism. If Gnosticism is on its way out because all of this technology didn't help them, right? The simulations that they were interested in since the 60s and before, it didn't work for them, right? It just simply didn't work. It's not a proper metaphor. It didn't substantiate their core belief because the core belief is psychotic. And even the technology didn't really, help them there, right? They were hoping to prove their theory that this world is a simulation. Well, it's not. And their theory is stupid because it was said about the light. How could they know that the light they see here is inferior to the light that's up there if you've never seen it? At least if you could prove it to me, I might believe you. But since you can't, and the whole thing is ridiculous, then it falls away. You can't tell me about. If you tell me that it's a theory, well, you tell me anything, right? You can tell me the moon is made of cheese. I don't let my mind be so guided that way. I want rational proofs. And Gnosticism doesn't have them. It's all Mysteria generated. And when you see somebody like, my friend who's sort of, getting a little bit possessed by it, there was a Gnostic center not far away. Within 5 miles of where this all happened, there was a prominent Gnostic center on Alma Avenue or whatever the hell, Middlefield Road or whatever the hell in Palo Alto. I actually went there myself. I was studying all these different paths. I was a member of Sufism and all of this. And something in the end, I don't know what it was, stopped me going. But I was right there at the door. I actually went up there. I took the number down, and they had the symbol on the thing. I was thinking, you can go to the little church. But something, by that time, it was starting to melt. Something just in my own studies. I came across Gerald Massey and all this, and it started to weaken. But when you don't have those alternative sources, this can be very, very attractive. Yes, as pathological it is. But then going back to the core equation, I didn't have a bad relationship with my own body. So something inside of me was not going to go for Gnosticism. You could experiment, you could go see what they're like, have some tea and biscuits with them and all and find out what they believe. But I was never going to become one because I really do believe that you have to be a frigid type. You have to be an armored type is the only word right now I can think of, right? In the Reichian sense. And you want to get out of reality. But your core reality is your own body. That is reality. You experience the other reality actually secondarily, right? Your reality is the right brain, but the left brain has come on, as its simulation. We're already dealing with simulation in the left brain. And also in a aberrant, malignant relationship with the body. And that really put me off Gnosticism. I start to see that the coloring, some of the sophistry, some of even the beauty that Gnosticism has in some of its iterations, and then this whole thing about hierarchies and all, it didn't work. So I'd say by the latest 92, maybe a bit after that 93, I was done with it. And then I got involved in other things, that then continued to confirm that original doubt.
Right. You had this figured out before I was even 5 years old. What I think is important, I know 2020 saw a lot of suicides, and really, I think these ideas are at the root of the belief that suicide could even be a solution, honestly.
That's right.
Because when people do commit suicide, isn't it with the belief that they're going to have some relief from reality? Yeah, but there's no reality other than self. That is the only reality that you could ever experience. And the same goes for God. To quote your book, the only experience capable of proving that God exists is a man's own experience. An intelligent God would not be ignorant of the fact that no individual is capable of convincing others of his existence. Right. So with those two statements, the entire enterprise of explaining a higher reality beyond this one and how you even know about it to begin with is so dubious, then that it all falls apart right there with those two statements, that you cannot do that. And what are you escaping by committing suicide? Are you not going to just enter into a different type of body, a different type of reality or experience? If existence is the only thing that exists, there could be no non-existence to flee to. I mean, that's a philosophical question each person needs to answer for themselves. But I want people to think about it that way. And maybe if they're even, ever encountering an individual that's got having a bad run and thinks that all the despair that they're feeling has something to do with the brokenness of their self or the imperfection of the world, not understanding that despair is their greatest teacher and what will guide them to the full unfoldment or further unfolding, because there is no final unfolding of the self. It is a continual, infinite process.
Yeah, and the suicidal person is another one that is moving from this uncomfortableness in the body. It's perfectly logical to commit suicide if your body is a source of unpleasure. It's not pathological at all. It's normal. It's normal. Because the suicide that we're talking about now is the extreme where you take your life. Yeah, long before that, people are dead. Emotional plague is deadening in the first place. So half the people you see are suicides, even if they're walking around. Right? So the actual suicide act is like, before that you've been bulimic. Before that you've been pill popping, before that you've been in some way deeply hurt by life and cut off by life and not animated by heroic people or heroic films or music. You see, there's something already deadened. That's what emotional plague is. It's a deadening, because the very erogenous zones have never been a source of pleasure, thanks to mom, right? And so then there's only nature has ordained it that if something is meant to be a source of pleasure and enjoyment and satisfaction is not. They can only be deadening. They can only be the opposite of that. You think this is 101, but that's why these medicos are so incompetent, right? The simple fact is that then your body becomes a deep source of unpleasure. And there's only certain much that, certain people can tolerate that. Now, one way to get out of it is to renounce the body, like we've been talking about, in that Gnostic way, and then turn to religion or something off-world, or even simulations, or believing in aliens, like you said.
Seeking euphoria in the collective consensus trance, too.
Definitely
that's something we didn't touch on, but one of the most mind-blowing things that you helped me realize was that joining the protest, going on the march, or whatever the thing is that you're jumping in and surrendering your own will to the crowd is a euphoric experience. And being someone that doesn't do that, and I've never been drawn to doing that. I've never joined groups or, any of that. I identified as an ism or an ist. It just never clicked for me that is actually where people are deriving the pleasure of their experience from. That's the real hook that they're addicted to. We kind of need to wrap up, though. We're almost to the end of the second hour. There's so much more to get into, but I guess I'll let you take this point to wrap up the thoughts, or maybe respond to that last statement and see if we can put a bow on this wonderful present that we have for all the listeners, because this interview has been phenomenal.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm going to continue working on this. There's a series, we're going to be doing on Gnosticism soon to really delve deeply into this. But we've touched on so many matters here, and it is absolutely not just statement to say that people who are depressed and suicidal, and then the ones who go into religion and Gnosticism, it is a cult of mortification. And Wilhelm Reich is one of the great pillars that can prove it. And what we've got to do is make the unusual connection between what we've been saying about your relationship with your body, the malignant one, and big worldwide philosophies and theologies like Gnosticism. So there's a disconnect. People aren't going to connect the two. But because of the advent of psychology, you now have the tools that you didn't have prior to 1930. And strangely, that's the very blip in history. So people like myself feel justified then to continue iterating it, because, America has always been a very anti-psychological country anyway. And even though, maybe 100 years has gone by, it's been 100 years of trying to avoid many psychological insights. So that's just my platform. It's very unpopular, but it's needed. And so out of that, I still think it's because it's benefited me. And I've actually seen people be saved from total psychosis by just some of these simple truths, right? That's been my living experience. And when you see something that is really, really harmful and so utterly dangerous, right, you're just moved to do something about it spontaneously. And so my experiences in America, California, this was the daily experience. I don't know what experience other people were having. I was noticing morning, noon, and night, every second, every minute, waking minute, this, thing. And I always found it very interesting that I get there within days and, we're dealing with Gnostic books. So there's something even physically, like, wait a minute, this is like my entrance into the country. We're having, long talks about the Dead Sea Scrolls and Gnosticism and ancient Jewish mythology, history and all. And it never kind of stopped, because then I found Stefan Holler's book and just dived in there, and I found, the sort of, there's these other iterations of it, like the marriage of Christian Rosencrantz, there's a lot of other spin-off, like I say, there's a whole Gnostic cults over there. They've got whole sections in bookstores, and it's easy to gravitate toward all of that. And it has hermetic elements within it, you see. And to me, it was a very, very deep fascination. But it just so happened that because I wasn't drenched in emotional plague or whatever, had plenty of other problems, but not that quite as bad. And I didn't quite become a disciple of it. And in the end, then, reading the Alvin Boy Kuhns and people like it started to actually turn against it, So, yeah, it was never a plan. It was never a planned thing. But I think it may be dying. I think the penthouse executive is dead, but the thing turns over by an act of deception. Well, that just emboldens you then to want to break in and show to the world, what's happened, kick the door open and say, yeah, this thing is gone for Burton. I think it's very, very important, but also to fill the void, because people are so saturated that when they awaken, say they wake up and they go, where am I? What's happened? You've been on hypnosis. You want to be able to then set up something to nourish those souls,
selfhood,
so that they've got something there to nourish by, instead of just being left in a desert.
Yes, selfhood would be that replacement, which really all of this
definitely.
Mysteria is the replacement for selfhood. Selfhood's the original.
Yeah, it is. And it's a very psychosomatic thing. It's not an idea. It's not Mysteria. It's an actual process of re-visioning the body, reintroducing yourself to it. It's intelligent, and having a kind of a sensitivity and receptivity so that when it speaks to you, as it's doing all the time, you're actually listening. That selfhood is a very palpable, very grounded thing. Jung definitely accepted that. Maybe not as much as Wilhelm Reich and the others did, but that's not a fault. He definitely led up to that. And the archetypes are as much of the body, the shadow. I keep talking about shadow work in that way, that shadow work is nothing more than body language. You know what I mean? But studying the opposite, the schizoid things, Julian James's bicameral mind fits into this because it deals with trauma, an original trauma that stopped this and brought Gnosticism around. So if you scroll back in history, there was the cataclysms. Gnosticism, we didn't talk about it, is also born out of a major psychic trauma that caused this disconnect, that caused the left brain or ego to develop over other types of mentation, which was very psychosomatic. How did that voice get suppressed? Because if it was so bloody powerful, then it should be speaking all the time and we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? Yeah, something extraordinary must have happened in order to silence that voice. Well, something extraordinary did. And that is the center of my work, right? The effects of trauma. But the trouble is that the traumatized soul cannot address his wound. So it's only until the late 1930s, right, the turn of the millennium back then, that the mind even had the wherewithal to turn and say, who am I again? And then we call that psychology. Psychology is so recent So the healing is recent. We've only made a few baby steps yet, and that's why we need to, like I did that World in Your Head article, because I want to bring the Ranks and the Reiches and the Adlers, right? Everybody that's spoken, I'm bringing them all to the table because we're still in very, very early stages. We want to hear from, Julian James and from, a Karen Horney. We want to hear all the voices because this is definitely ongoing. And we want to bring in the critics, the Thomas Zazas, the Jean-Paul Sartres, who go, you got a lot of problems there. Well, tell us about it, right? Because we want a pure thing. We want purity. And so we need these caustic, corrosive voices. We want the detergent to be always put there as well, so that some of the dirtier elements, come in, because the ego is in charge, remember. And so that will already, throw things off. It's like we talked about in other programs about when a person comes in for a bit of psychology and they're telling you about their infancy. I am dealing with their memories of their infancy, not what happened in their infancy. That's the point. Even Freud discovered it, the displacement, the self-deception, the chicanery that goes on with the mind, and the levels of interpretation. You're not getting dreams experience speaking to you directly. You're getting the ego's waking interpretation of a dream. Oh dear, right? So the psychology tried to bypass that. Freud was always working on ways to try and bypass that censor, the different successes or whatever. But the ego's control is quite deep. It goes quite deep. So you have all sorts of different paradigms, hypnosis, all these different attempts. And then Wilhelm Reich comes on and says, we've got to get rid of the mind altogether. Just give me the body. Lay down. We'll work on your centers. We'll work on your musculature. We can't trust the mind. We can't trust the tongue. It's totally forked. You've got so many defenses, but the one place you don't have them, or at least where you do have them, there's a different addressing those things is bioenergy. So Reich is the key man then that brought in therapy of the body.
I think, Michael, you'd find it really fascinating, some of the research I've done on biofield tuning and using tuning forks and sound to work with the biofield anatomy, as it's being called now. It's a very new field, but essentially there's an architecture to the field around your body, about 6 feet around one side to the other, and different archetypal energies, if you will, have certain containers in this biofield, and the distance it is from the physical core there, that informs you as to the chronological depth of whatever the trauma is that's stuck in the field. And this work is monumental. I don't know if you've seen much of it because it is so recent. Within the last 10 years, practitioners with tuning forks have been mapping out the biofield based on
I'm familiar with it.
Very interesting stuff, and using the most essential component of reality, which is sound, which is also electricity. People don't understand that sound and electricity are just different parts of the same wavelength of frequency.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in it. It's resonance theory, right? There's a guy called Randy Masters I used to know in Aptos, California. He worked with this. Another colleague of mine is very big into this with those tuning forks. That would be one of the supreme ways to rebalance yourself and come into harmony, right? The real harmony, which is something that you cannot have mentally. Right? It's psychosomatic all the way. And unfortunately, you'd think that with all our modernism, we'd be integrated the body years ago. Small demographic, maybe, but on the whole, no. The whole Western world has a huge missing part, and that's the soma. That's why so many people are grossly overweight, and getting worse. Health has just gone over the cliff, it's really, really bad. And then other disorders, it may not be obvious obesity or whatever, but it's a lot of other, diseases or, sugar addictions and all sorts of things, are pertaining to this. But if you come to harmony, and I'm a big believer in these alternative therapies, how can one talk about Reich and Yanov and, Alexander Lowen without? And as I said, this is something that needs to keep unfolding. And I'm glad to see modalities that are taking care of it. There's many. And you just taking care of your body, just factoring it in, right? But our Western world has only factored it in to the point of like jogging, working out, infantile. In fact, they can even bring on even worse armoring, because it's wrong thinking again about the nature of the body. So yeah, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and probably we'll have a whole, other session where we talk about that more in depth. Right now, I just recommend books, and I'd love to know more about this so I can put links below, when I'm talking about this. I like to have the latest modalities, because I think they're synthesized better and, they work better, and people have very short time now to heal. They don't have a lot of time in the working day. So yeah, definitely send me as much information on that as you can, Chance. And I give big thanks for it today as well. It's great to talk about these matters.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a lot left that we can cover together on either one of our shows. So we'll be in touch, especially my pleasure to be continuing to work with you on your premium shows. And so we'll be talking tomorrow for that. A motorcycle just drove by. If you guys could hear that, I don't know. I got a neighbor with a real loud motorcycle. Not always convenient timing.
Neighbors are loose. Yeah, we had one loose earlier today. Yeah, thanks. Because Brotherhood of Death will be up within this week. So that's going to be thrilling.
Yep, followed by Age of Dionysus and the Moral Universe. Really fascinating questions, especially in the latter one. So yeah, we'll speak soon. Everybody, check out Michael's work. Thanks for this conversation, man. It was really seminal material for my program, in my opinion. It's hopefully just people's introduction to these topics, and they're ready to go further. Thanks, man.
Oh, yeah. You're welcome.